Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Through Her Lens Conversations on Reframing the Domestic. Before we begin, I'd like to apologize if the connection is not very good during some parts of the session, because some of us are based in the Northeast and the network has been affected by the weather conditions. And our speaker, Dipti Tamang, is also based in Darjeeling, and she is also trying her best to get online, but even her network is not that great, but she will be joining us soon. So just a few introductions before we begin. We are conducting this webinar as part of Zubaan and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation's Fragrance of Peace project, which aims to broaden the scope of research and literary work in the northeastern states of India by strengthening existing networks, building new partnerships, and facilitating cultural exchange. This webinar series is running parallel to the online photo exhibition Through Her Lens Reframing the Domestic, curated by me and Anusha Pradhan. Submissions are open and guidelines are on our website and social media. The link to the submissions page will be up on the chat box shortly. You can also view the online exhibition and previous webinars through the link in the chat box. I am Ridu and I will be hosting the discussion today. This is the second webinar in our series of conversations that hopes to engage with the issues of present challenges, the lockdown, the collapse of the public and the private space, the merging of paid, unpaid work, etc., and to see how all this is affecting marginalized communities in the Northeast. This series also aims to look at the element of visual research and what photography and archiving in a COVID and post-COVID world means, now that the boundaries between the story and the storyteller has collapsed, where stories have turned inwards and the personal as political has been foregrounded. The topic of today's webinar is titled Theory and Practice, Informing Photography with Feminist Methodologies. Today, we will be joined by Sheba Chhachhi, Dipti Tamang, and Agastaya Thapa. Some of the key ideas and concerns we will address today are a feminist critique of power relations in photography, photography's ability to create a space and how marginalized communities negotiate that space, and how the quiet force of photographs has been channelized by women around the world. I would now like to introduce our speakers for today in the order of the speaking. Each speaker will present for 10 minutes, following which they will be responding to questions. Sheba's lens-based works investigate contemporary questions about gender, the body, the city, cultural memory, and eco-philosophy through intimate sensorial encounters. Sheba began as an activist and photographer, documenting the women's movement in India. By the 1990s, she moved to create collaborative staged photographs, eventually turning to large multimedia installations. She experiments across the spectrum of durational mediums, creating immersive environments which bring the contemplative into the political in both site-specific public art and independent works. She is exhibited widely in India and internationally. Her works are held in significant public and private collections, including Tate Modern UK, Kiran Nadar Museum Delhi, Bose Pachia New York, Singapore Art Museum, Devi Art Foundation Delhi, and National Gallery of Modern Art India. Sheba has published writings, given talks, and conducted workshops, research, and projects relating to women, conflict, urban ecologies, visual culture, and contemporary art practice in both institutional and non-formal contexts. She lives and works in New Delhi. Dipti is an assistant professor at the Darjeeling Government College. Her research interests are women and conflict, gender, and identities in the Eastern Himalayas. She's also a researcher under the Zubaan SPF grant, working currently on women's agency within the Gorkha movement. Agastaya is currently an independent researcher. She completed her PhD from the School of Arts and Aesthetics at JNU New Delhi in 2017. Her thesis entitled Circuits of Representation, Visual Art Practices, and the Formation of the Subject in Darjeeling from the Colonial Period to the Present looked at representation through the lens of tourist art and colonial ethnology. Her research interests include colonial visual culture, photography, popular paintings and prints, Eastern Himalayan history, and socio-political movements. Before we begin, I would like to outline a few rules for the participants. First of all, thank you all for joining us today. Your video and audio have been automatically turned off on entry. Please do keep them turned off. Audience questions will be taken via the chat box, which we will close once we get a certain number of questions that can be answered today. However, the raised hand function will still be available to direct any queries at the host, which is me, along with other hosts from Zubaan/THL in their names. We will start dealing with audience questions around 4:40 p.m. once all three speakers are finished. If there's any speaker in particular you want to direct your question to, please make sure to mention that as well. The discussion will be recorded and posted online via our social media channels. The list of participants will not be available. If you choose to ask a question via the chat box or speak, your name might be displayed during the webinar. Entry has been moderated to guard against trolling. No hate speaking or discriminating against any community will be tolerated. Any participants using such speech will be removed from the webinar without warning. Regarding posting or quoting any of our speakers today, outside of this session and on social media, you are first required to get consent from the speakers. You can send us the quotes and we will share those with the speakers. So we'll begin a session with Sheba Chhachhi.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this project, which offers, I think, unprecedented possibilities for women photographers in the Northeast, not just photographers, but writers and researchers. And I'm very pleased to be part of it. I think this is really necessary also to redress the kind of balance in the sort of representation that the Northeast has conventionally received. I'm going to speak a little bit about my photographic archive of the women's movement and show you just a small excerpt, a set of images, and move on to the experiment I did in staged collaborative photography. And through these two excerpts from these two bodies of work, draw out some of the questions that one faces as a feminist photographer and the kinds of processes that I have experimented with in dealing with those questions. I'm just trying to put on my PowerPoint. Give me a minute. I started as a documentary photographer. It was 1980. It was the peak of the anti-dowry movement in Delhi. I had just returned to Delhi after some years of being away to study. And I began to photograph. I was very active in the movement. So these photographs were really taken from within. I was literally pointing the camera one moment and shouting slogans the next. I built up this record primarily of protests, but also of street plays, of agitprop theater, of workshops, of meetings, of celebrations, exchanges over a period of over 10 years, almost 15 years. So I'd like to begin with just showing you a few images from this archive. Around the end of the 80s, having been having been a photographer, documenter, and archivist of the women's movement, certain questions began to really trouble me. The images that I had created were important images. They were necessary images. And they were a counter to the kind of mass media representation of women, the domestic woman, or the luxurious jeweled Maharani type of woman, or the victim. These were images of women protesting, struggling, seeking to change their conditions, seeking a kind of social transformation, and challenging patriarchy. However, I began to question whether in these 10, 15 years, I had not, in fact, contributed to the creation of a new stereotype. While challenging the stereotypes of the mass media, had I created the new stereotype of the militant woman, fist in the air, mouth stretched in a shout? What exactly was I representing? Was it a one-dimensional image of the movement? Other questions, which were about documentary practice itself, had been troubling me for some time, and they became increasingly urgent. The first was the claim that documentary photography makes towards truth. It claims to be an objective representation of reality, while in fact, every process of making a photograph, and I don't use the word shooting or taking, I like to say making, in terms of how you frame, what you include, what you exclude, what lens you use, what distance you have from the subject, whether you stand above the subject, whether you are from below the subject, whether you are at the same eye level as the subject, etc., produces the image. These choices, these decisions are made from the subjectivity of the photographer. That subjectivity may be informed by a number of things, from her exposure to photography, to her training, to what attracts her, to what draws her, to what she thinks might make a good image. But this is definitely not an objective representation of reality. This truth claim of photography remains a vexed one. And I think in an era where selfies, Photoshop manipulation, which is used to absolutely dangerous ends politically, rule the image field, these questions actually take on a different kind of character. But at the time that I'm speaking of, none of this was there. It was the tradition, the dominant tradition was the tradition of photojournalism, which made this claim to accurately represent reality. My feeling was, my argument is that it is an interpretation of reality. It's a representation of reality. The other question that was troubling me was the question of power relations. As a feminist, which is for me a political philosophy, I had trained my mind to understand, analyze, and deconstruct power relations in patriarchal society and in society as a whole, not only to do with women, but to do with all sets of relationships. What kind of relationship was the photographer and the subject? What sort of relationship was appearing there? As the person who used the camera, who operated the camera, who made the choices about the manner of interpretation and the manner of representation, what kind of power relationship was I enacting in relation to my subjects? For me, this question tied in with a key feminist idea, which all of you must be familiar with, which is the idea of agency. So the question really was, what agency do the women that I've been photographing over all these years, what agency do they have in their own representation? So these two questions, the question of agency and the question of subjectivity, led me to experiment. And I entered into a collaborative experiment with 7 women activists. These were women I had known since the 1980s and photographed since the 1980s. But here I invited them to collaborate in their own representation, where we could together produce an image which she might feel, where she would have a say in how she was represented. So I invited each woman to choose a place, objects, elements to include in the image which she felt could tell her story. And together we would create this kind of mise en scène, a kind of theatrical stage setting within which she would present herself to my camera. I was seeking a kind of place where the balance of power between photographer and the photographed was shifted to some extent, not entirely, but to some extent. I was also seeking a place through the kinds of differences, the differences of class, education, privilege, which separated me as a photographer from some of the women that I was photographing, not all of them, but some of them for sure. How does one bridge alterity? How does one find a form which is authentic in its communication without reproducing exploitative power relations? I was seeking a kind of intersubjectivity, a subjectivity that was somehow between us, between me and the woman I was photographing. It was her subjectivity and my subjectivity meeting to create something for that time and space in the making of the photograph. So I'd like to show you some of these, just a very tiny excerpt from this experiment. This is Shah Jahan Appa, first photographed in 1981. Her daughter had been murdered for dowry, and she became one of the prominent activists, particularly in setting up Shakti Shalini, a legal aid center for women who were being harassed within the family, particularly for dowry. And an extraordinary woman who sadly passed away some years ago. So this is a photograph from 1980 where she's holding up the photograph of her murdered daughter. Another one taken somewhere in the early 90s, I think 91, 92, with Appa, we called her Appa, listening very carefully to a colleague, to a woman in one of the bastis she worked in. This is Dakshin Puri. And then the stage portrait. Here Appa holds the burqa, which she said was something that she had to include, but she did not wish to wear within the photograph. Just under her knee is this tiny kind of cardboard hut made out of a shoebox. And it has a kind of jhomper on top made out of paper. And she brought it. These sessions would stretch over many months, up to 3 to 4 months of speaking, of thinking, of selecting things, selecting objects, selecting spaces. So she brought this to one of our meetings, saying, "Meri kahani jhuggi jhompri ki kahani hai." My story is a shanty town story. So the burqa, the jhuggi, the sewing machine, which had been crucial in her narrative of surviving economically for the many years that she had to struggle on her own. At the foot of the bed in the stage portraits are photographs that I had taken of her across the years of her in the women's movement. She was a very powerful orator, and these became an important element in the image. Here I show you the setup, the room, and Appa within that room. So for me, the constructed portrait, the stage portrait, does several things. One is it makes absolutely no pretense at being an objective record. It is staged. The subject is completely aware of being photographed. She looks most often straight into the lens, confronting both the camera and the viewer. The closest experience that most working class women at that time, I'm talking about the 80s, 90s, before mobile phones, had with photography was actually going to a bazaar a studio in the bazaar where you would pose for a photograph. So this idea of posing, sometimes with props, I mean, the studios often offered props, this idea of posing, presenting yourself in a manner that you liked was not an alien one. So what we did together was something that borrowed from that vernacular tradition of photography, as well as something that was quite unique to us and unique to each woman activist who was telling her story as a woman, as a feminist, and as activist in the women's movement in Delhi. I sometimes show all of these together, which form a kind of narrative, a narrative which stretches across 10 years from 1981 to 1990. And one of the things I was challenging here was also the idea of the single essence. There are key ideas in photography, the idea of the decisive moment, the single essence which reveals the subject, etc. And I was very critical of these ideas because they seem to actually perpetuate the kind of power exercised by the individual authorship of the photographer and completely leave out, exclude the agency of the subject. Also, for me, these were narratives, these were stories, and the women were far more complex than any particular single image might be. It was the reason I felt that my images of them in protest were unidimensional and needed to be opened up in ways that could truly reflect the contradictions, the complexities, and the nuances of richly lived, very full lives, lives in which both the personal and the political were manifest. You saw this image right at the beginning of the excerpt from the archive. This is Satyarani Chadha, 1980. Again, the mother of a young woman who, the one you see in her graduation gown in the photograph she's holding, murdered, brutally murdered for dowry. She fought a court case for, I think, almost 25 years. And sadly, by the time she got justice, the man in question had disappeared. The usual stories of complicity between police, the legal system, but she was absolutely extraordinary, both in her pursuit of the case relating to her daughter's murderer, as well as the pursuit of cases of other women who had faced similar brutality and abuse. So from 1980, where I first encountered Satyarani, to 1991, she chose the Supreme Court as the location for her portrait. And arranged on the steps are the 70 case files that she was involved with at that moment. She became almost like kind of paralegal advisor. Snaking through the files is her daughter's wedding sari, and once again, the portrait of the daughter in her graduation gown. Similar elements, but a very different location. This is at home in her residence in Punjabi Bagh, where the grief, the tiredness, and the despair, along with the determination, are allowed to show. So these three images constitute the portrait of Satyarani, the staged portrait and the steps of the Supreme Court, the anti-dowry demonstration, and the private, the image located in the more private space. There are 7 such portraits. It's part of a series called 7 Lives in a Dream, but I don't think we have the time to talk about that. But I'd like to just go back. Sorry. Of course, at the end, we must have Urvashi and her stage portrait. And with this, I'm going to end the slideshow. And can you tell me if I've taken too much time already, or do I have a few minutes? Well, I'll just carry on. So to just come back to these key ideas that I've tried to open up, which is the idea of agency. Patriarchy denies women agency. Social structure, family structure, customary law, the legal system, all deny women's agency, seeking, particularly within the family, actions, decisions, choices are made on behalf of women and not by women for themselves. So, this has been a key aspect of all our work in trying to understand how women can free themselves from patriarchal structures. However, the idea of agency itself is not simply answered by saying a woman must have agency. She must be able to make choices. I think it's very important to understand that it is a complex, wide arena. A woman, any woman, including myself, would have internalized patriarchal attitudes, which would influence the kind of choices I make. So simply having choice for me doesn't constitute agency, but informed choice. And to go further than that, choice which is wise in the sense that it is informed, it is contextualized, it has grown. It is not a choice made too quickly and without enough reflection. So self-reflexivity, both on the terms, both on the side of the photographer who is working with a particular subject and the subject's own self-reflexivity to achieve something that we might describe as agency. The second question of subjectivity, I think I've gone into considerably, so I won't go into that again. But I think linking both is the question of the self-reflexive researcher, photographer, writer, subject, and that this self-reflexivity is grounded in a situated understanding, grounded in particular locations of where you come from, your background, your context, and all of these constitute the possibility of perhaps a kind of feminist methodology, particularly in a form like photography, which is pre-invested in reproducing certain hierarchical relationships. Thank you.
We have Deepti on now.
So basically, I would like to locate what I would like to speak in terms of how I would like to approach photography as a medium of, what and how it acts as a powerful medium of representation, especially for a lot of communities with stories, with histories which have been distorted, misrepresented, or marginalized in the mainstream. And since I'm also a novice and in a learning process, this is something I'm continuing to engage with. And over the years, as part of my journey with my own research on women in conflict and in the region of Darjeeling Hills and the Northeast also, which I've been exploring, I've been looking at how art or like photography as a medium of representation presents a very, very powerful tool. So I would like to begin by first, if I contextualize it in the case of like Darjeeling Hills, then if you see most of the dominant representation of the region in terms of how it's represented through photography, it sort of is in sync with the larger, representation of the place, sort of troped through romanticized ideas of mountains, tea gardens, mysticism, and a lot of romanticism in the hills, right? Uh, so if you look at the relevant or like mainstream pictures, which is even there inside and outside of the region, so mostly it's dominated by images of the mountains, the hillsides, and if you go deeper into the pictures, you'll see a lot of pictures on the tea gardens and images of, specifically because my research is on foregrounds questions of gender. So immediately when I use the gender lens, what happens is the images that come starkly in mind is that of like a happy smiling face of a woman, female tea garden worker, you know, working and carrying the doko, which is the basket which in which the tea garden is plucked and kept, of like, you know, very happy smiling pictures of tea garden workers, which sort of disguises and also like misrepresents and misreproduce it reproduces an idea of the tea garden workers as very happy and, you know, exoticizing, romanticizing the poverty and the harsh conditions under which the tea garden workers are currently working, and their livelihood and lived realities, right? So when those kind of images have been doing circulation, and when it's being reflected in the writings of fiction and popular culture and all of it, also it constantly seeks to represent a particular community, our communities, as always within these tropes of exoticized ideas of and romanticized ideas of poverty. And, you know, there's it also not only just that, but it also conceals the numerous layers which defines our existence, which are part of our histories, which is very, very, like, you know, tormented, and in which you find multiple layers and questions of identities, contested identities, histories of conflicts, which have been hidden within these layers. So when I started going out into the field, and to be very honest, my actual research started only after I submitted my PhD, and I came back to this place, and I've been looking into questions of women in conflict, and going back to looking at how women have been rewriting their histories, or if I locate women in the histories that are present of the place. What was very jarring and to my face was the stark absence, you know, the void in terms of which there is a very minimal record of women's histories in terms of representation, in terms of their stories, in terms of their voices, just in terms of their presence in the places. So when then I started looking back and rethinking and reanalyzing these questions and looking at conflict, where the focus of my research is primarily on the agitation of 86, which introduced a rigorous process of militarization into the region, the history of violence that the community had to suffer, the history of conflict that the community had to endure. It was very difficult for me to find records of those events of places. So when I started going out into the field, when I started talking to people and women who had lived to see the conflict, and starting with my own personal space of, like, you know, my speaking to my mother or speaking to my family members, women who had lived through that moment, at that time any sort of document, any sort of evidence, or to, like, you know, apart from what I was hearing in terms of like lived testimonies, oral testimonies from these women, it became very, very important. So sort of picking up from where in the last conversation Professor Kikon was talking about the idea of photography as evidence, that became very, very important for me. So you know, and then again, the idea of what you think is completely irrelevant or completely out of context suddenly takes new meaning, and it has a sort of a new a way of, like, you know, interpreting those realities that might have occurred at that time. So when there was no evidence of, for instance, say like women were talking to me about like sexual abuse of a lot of women were talking to me about the atrocities of the CRPF, about the violence that was taking place, and about their own experiences of how they would be fearful of the night, how they would be taking care of the households, managing the households alone, and how the gender roles were altered. Then when I went back to, like, you know, even looking at like photographs of my own, like, because I was born in the 86 period, and then I was looking at those photographs after hearing the stories, after talking to my mother about those times, and then locating her in those pictures and locating the place, the context, everything, like it made sense, you know. So a new story was emerging from all of those pictures, and the power of those pictures, of those images, in terms of everything, like, you know, the bodily representation of even her story of how she has transcended boundaries in terms of her being and from Bhutan as a Nepali refugee from there, and then which was then ascribed in her clothing, in her body, and then which later on when she became here and now she's an Indian Nepali, that you can see it all in those photographs. So my journey, my understanding of art as a medium of representation was gradually emerging from there. So for me, and then when gradually I started meeting a lot of other people also, artists and people who've been engaged in using art as a medium, which initially because all of us are so used to, again, I would like to say that in the Darjeeling Hills, for instance, if I look at other communities, marginalized communities, we can see how they have a very long history of using art as a powerful medium of asserting their stories, of keeping their stories alive. And this is something which I have been learning, which I have been seeing, like when I was in the Northeast last time for the Zubaan workshop also. I was just amazed by the numerous stories, the numerous records of interesting stories, everything about the cultural representation that they have kept alive, right? So when we came back, and the three of us who were there, we started forward this conversation with others. We also realized how a lot of us were individually in our own capacity doing these things. So when the exhibition took place in Namchi, and when we were asked to be there, it was such a wonderful experience, because we came to then come in contact with a lot of others also, other scholars, other activists who were doing similar kind of a work. And then this quest for amongst all of us to sort of reinvent or rewrite our own histories in terms of we are done with this colonial representation of the place, of the history, of the communities, and then an attempt to rewrite these places where foregrounding identities of different other smaller communities in the places, questions of gender. For instance, like one work which stuck with me after the exhibition at Namchi was that of, I think, Ambika. She had submitted a work, photography on the female potters, bhariyas of Darjeeling, which is like very, very different from what the earlier image I talked about, the smiling, happy, romanticized ideas of female migrant workers also. Because then she's foregrounding her research on migration, bringing in the gendered consequences, the gendered lens of it, which presented a very refreshing take on the subject matter also, because migration is such a pertinent question and reality of the people of these places, especially then foregrounding it through the lens of gender brought in an entirely different dimension. So because my experience of in this context, I feel that this dialogue and the exhibition that took place in Namchi, and carrying forward of this dialogue, opens up that space where I think that powerfully these kind of new rewriting of spaces is being opened up, and where it's being very, very crucially that the domestic is now being interconnected as where the personal is closely being connected to the political. And it's a project in the making where which is also where I'm coming in with my own understanding and perception, and trying to learn more and engage with people who are already doing uh, who are already working as photographers, who are already working as artists in the field. Because to be very honest, like for me, art was always very, very intimidating. I mean, I always used to think and feel very intimidated by art. I was like, uh, do I even understand art? Like it has such a fancy, glamorous concept around it. But then it is in the alternative platform, in how art is being used as this medium of representation, of reclaiming spaces for the marginalized, and bringing in voices and reproducing these stories, where I think I'm more interested and more learning and humbly approaching the subject. Because I think it does act as a very, very powerful medium, especially for communities which have always been on the margins, and when you have always been on the other side of the lens, where you're being represented through these particular tropes, and then the story keeps getting reinforced and reproduced through these uh, platforms. So I think that engaging in these kind of a conversation, engaging in a dialogue, initiating it, also opens up to us to new spaces or new ways of imagining, where equality and collaboration, like Professor Kikon had mentioned, is a very, very important concept. And I think that's how I would also like to approach this idea of how I perceive photography as a medium, especially in the context of what kind of research I'm doing, and how I think that it constantly seeks to produce reproduce the stories of the people, and especially women of this place. So yeah, I think that's how I look at it, and that's how I'm constantly learning. And I think like that's what I would like to engage with. I mean, like opening it up to dialogue through question answers or conversations after this.
Thank you so much, Deepti. I'm so glad the connection worked at the right time.
Yeah, yeah.
So now we have Agastya Thapa with us. Agastya, would you like to start?
Um, Thank you for having me here with you, Vidisha, and everybody involved. This is such an exciting and interesting way to, I guess, weather the COVID storm. Um, so, let me start by first thanking you and thanking the speakers and everybody present here. And I would also like to thank Nayantara and Shikhar from Nepal Picture Library who helped me a lot in providing me with image rights for this talk. So I am going to read out a small paper that I prepared for this session. I hope I'll be okay. So here I go. The question of why photography for women will be explored in my talk with special focus on one image which was collected during the Feminist Memory Project undertaken by the Nepal Picture Library in 2018 for the duration of 6 months. The explosive and often subversive power of photography has served many political and social movements in the history of the world. However, the quiet force of the photograph has been well understood and channelized by women all over the world who have set out to change the tides of time. Within this framework, I'll attempt to bring out certain values which will throw light on the work of photography for women. My discussion on photography and feminist methodologies will be firmly tethered to the time I was working as a researcher on the Feminist Memory Project for Nepal Picture Library in the summer of 2018. It proved to be an enriching and expansive experience for me, for which I'll be forever grateful. The task at hand was tremendous. I was working with 2 fellow researchers and 2 lead curators of the project. And we had the whole of the history of women's movement in Nepal stretched out like a silent ocean, reaching out to us only in small, hesitant waves. These waves were no sooner taken back by the shimmering ocean as we leapt to grasp it. The main intent of the project was to tell this history through photographs. Photography has, since its inception in the 19th century, it's been known for its documentary value, the camera poised to capture reality. As Susan Sontag reminds us in her work on photography, that photographs furnish instant history, instant sociology, instant participation. This explosive potential of photography would be harnessed like a powder keg to carve out a looking hole into the history of women's movement in Nepal. All of us worked at a feverish pace to meet these brave women who had in their own ways changed the course of history to make women a visible and necessary component of public life in Nepal. Almost all of them were open to the idea of telling the stories through photographs. They had lovingly preserved these flimsy time portals, and they generously gave us access to these often personal photographs. The number of photographs that we collected for the project far exceeded our expectations as they kept sending us photographs and more photographs. Many stories that had been forgotten or tucked away in the far and dusty reaches of their consciousness came tumbling out once the photographs broke the dam of their memories. The silent power of photographs to activate memories of things, people, and events became a cornerstone of the project, as many unknown and long forgotten moments in the history of Nepal came forth. One such revelation came in the form of a small black and white photograph, yellowed and crinkled. The photograph was so old and weathered, however, it carried in it a powerful story of resistance and resilience. The photograph was taken at the Dili Bazar prison in Kathmandu in 1961, close at the heels of the coup d'etat by King Mahindra when he suspended the constitution dissolved the elected parliament, and imprisoned the then Prime Minister B.P. Koirala. The photograph captured the defiant faces of two young women as they faced the camera through prison bars. A guard stood watch over them. These women were identified as Prem Kumari Tamang of Nuwakot and Lal Maya Tamang of Dhading. They had been arrested for their opposition to King Mahindra's coup. After the completion of the project, as I headed back from Kathmandu, I had the good fortune of acquiring an enlarged print of the same photograph. They quickly found a pride of place in the image board above my study table. They are there for every part of my existence as I entered the room. Sontag is absolutely right when she points out that photographs are pseudo-presence and token of absence at once. However, as I look at the photograph of these brave women from a distant time and place, I can't help but think of how the photograph as a force field which transmits waves of solidarity and recognition. So this is my short paper presentation, and it's very short, sorry. But the thing I wanted to bring out in this discussion is the fact that what feminist methodology and can take from a photographs or photographic practice is the fact that that photographs, even though a lot can be said about their truth value, about claims of objectivity and other such very heavy claims of photography. But during the project, what came to fore was the fact that photographs have this ability to jog memory, certain forgotten aspects which have been long forgotten and buried.
Hi, Agastya. Sorry, actually, Mridu got disconnected.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I'm just stepping in for a second while she gets back on. And her network is also very shaky.
Okay.
So just no, it's fine. I think we can go on to the questions now.
Oh, sure.
And we have a couple of questions already. That's fine, right? Yeah, so we'll just start off with the questions, and I think the first is addressed to Sheba. So we will do one round of questions and then we'll come back to everyone.
Sure.
Sheba, here's the first question. Why do you say making a photograph and not shooting or creating? And I'd like to club the second question as well, that you mentioned that informing the subject of being the focus of photography adds a self-representation of the story. So does it not create a ripple in the candid moment that would have been created?
Sorry, could you repeat the second question, please?
You mentioned that informing the subject of being the focus of photography adds a self-representation of the story. So does it not create a ripple in the candid moment that it would have created?
The first question is, I think shooting is to do with guns and not cameras. And if you use your camera like a gun, and you say, I'm shooting someone when you're photographing them, I think it reveals a kind of extremely male, militarist, and aggressive relationship to photography. So I don't like to use the word shooting, even though it's common parlance amongst all photographers. I also don't like taking because it implies a one-way action. So it's like photojournalists who parachute into a situation, take a photograph and leave. That photograph has value, it is useful, it informs the world, perhaps of things that it might not have known otherwise. It's not that I'm dismissing the value, the evidential value or the value as resonant with memory, or the many uses of that kind of photography. But I think as feminists, we have to question what sort of power relations are inherent in those, and what do they actually produce. It is very important to remember that these are interpretations. Now we know that when we see images of women, that these, what kind of lens in terms of perspective they have come through, and we can deconstruct the kind of conventions that produce certain sorts of images of women, like beautiful, airbrushed, etc., etc. We have learned to do this. This is an analytic capacity which is not shared by everyone. For another person, perhaps this is truth, this is evidence, this is what a woman is. And this is something that we continue to challenge in our struggle over representation. The second question about the candid versus the informed subject, the stage subject, I don't believe there is any such thing as a candid subject. It also, I think that catching a person unawares from the side or from the back or apparently in a crowd is something that is, again, has no respect for that person. And I think respect is important. So while the candid, that's what I meant by the decisive moment, by the essential moment that one, and people also use the word capture, that one image that's supposed to capture the essence of the person. These are actually, sorry to say, lies. This is that particular person at that particular moment framed by that particular photographer. And that's it, you know? And it's very important to remember that, especially as practitioners. So for me, the candid doesn't actually, I think it's a kind of obfuscation. It muddles the ground. If you look at the history of photography, where a lot of photography is declared to be candid, from famous photographs by, say, Bresson, by, there's a whole number of examples which I won't go into. If you go back into history, you find that most of them that were so-called candid photographs were actually staged and created. So I hope that relates to your question somewhat.
Thanks, Sheba. I'd like to go to the next question, which is for Dipti. Dipti, you mentioned that the romanticized version of Darjeeling Hills misrepresents the social. How do we deconstruct the misrepresented reproduction of the Darjeeling Hills and the women?
Hi. So, yeah, like I was mentioning, maybe like we can begin by, looking beyond the ideas of the place in terms of just like mountains and tea gardens and mysticism, and how by beginning to ask the question, like, who is taking the photograph, or why are certain images being reproduced, why is it that certain like the place and the history of the place, or the history of the people and the communities of the place are constantly being reproduced within that particular image. So because these are places and communities which in the mainstream, these are like you have so many conflicted regions and places within the Indian territory, and they've always been imagined within the particular discourses that have centered around these places, and also because of the history of colonialism within which these towns and the stories of these towns are also deeply embedded, which you can find it in the physical space in terms of how like the whole place is structured around that and carries forward that colonial gaze, and how even now the relations of the place and the community, and what is it behind the struggles that keep coming forward in the place, that is not yet represented through these images or through a constant representation of the place. Because the minute you think of places like, for instance, you talk about Darjeeling Hills, or you talk about a hill station, the immediate concept is of relating it to the ideas of the colonial stereotypes, like, and then the stories and the histories of the place are constantly kept alive through these discourses. But what has happened to the place? What are the stories of the people of this place? What is more, or what lies beyond these gaze that has produced these places within these romanticized ideas? So, I mean, if you look at the plight of the tea garden workers, I'm sure it's not just much more, it's much more than the image of a woman who's carrying the doko and who's smiling and giving the tea. There's so much more in terms of how the conflict has affected the people, how the misadministration, how the relations between the workers, the administration, all of it has defined the lives of the people of this place. And in representing those histories through those particular specific images, I feel that it seeks to not just misrepresent, but also powerfully keep maintain that relation of domination, or like a particular kind of a representation of these of our communities. So I think, like, we can begin by trying to look at, like I said, how in the beginning when I started looking at photographs, also I grew up looking at these photographs of hills and mountains and all of this myself. And then when I started contextualizing it, and when these realities around me started affecting me or making sense to me because of the way that I was contextualizing my own research of the place, I started getting new stories and new meanings of what I had been constantly taking it as the only reality of the place. There was so much more beyond it, especially when I started then working in terms of the gender relations, in terms of representing and locating women's agency in the political movement. So what was being represented, first the void in terms of women's history, which dates back to the 86 movement, which is completely absent, like I said, and later on in the 2017 movement, I was there, so I was here located, so I was luckily I could document a lot of stuff that was happening around. I could document a lot of women's experiences in that manner. So which was for me rewriting of these histories by locating women in the center of it all. And not just in terms of treating women as passive recipients or passive victims, but as active agents who were involved in the movement in different forms, playing multiple roles, performing multiple responsibilities, and talking a lot about how they have been constantly engaging with the place. So I think, yeah, we can begin by, like I said in the beginning, how I used to perceive of photography as a very intimidating space. But now when I look at the alternative spaces of how alternative movements and relevance of photography and visual art and representation has played such a powerful role in bringing forth these voices, I would like to look at it and begin by locating it in terms of the silence that comes up, in terms of the absence. So I think maybe that's a good point from which we can start. And I hope it answers the question.
Thank you, Dipti. I'm so sorry, my internet connection went off for a bit. So the next question is for Agastya. There is a fine line between encroaching and representing, which photographers often tend to cross when talking about representing women from conflict areas. How should we as photographers take an ethical approach, especially the idea when we undertake the task of their representation, we stand to benefit, but for the subjects, the situation remains the same?
Well, I think that is something photographers have to accept, their role, that they are encroaching on someone's personal and oftentimes very difficult lives and very difficult stories. So I think it's I don't see how that can be in any way be observed or be rationalized. I think it's just a thing, that a responsibility, a kind of uh, that is something that the photographers have to accept, because even if they are benefiting, or even if they have true intentions, the fact remains that something important is being brought out through their tools and through their skills. So that is that the stories that they bring out, the kind of visibility that they will give to something um, which is absent, to something which nobody knows, something to snatch away the veil in a way, to make things clear, or to make things, to bring it to the fore. I guess the photographers will have to think about their role in those terms. But as far as them benefiting and them being um, um, predatory or encroach, encroaching on certain territories, I guess that's something that they'll have to accept, because I don't see anything that can, or any
Thank you.
rationalization that can circumvent that.
Right. Thank you so much. So I would just like to inform the participants and speak that we extended the session by 15 minutes. And the next question is for Sheba. So you say you were shooting from within the movement. I'm inspired by how unapologetic that is. Where the archive live? How can younger generations within the movement engage with your archive?
At the moment, the archive is with me. I'm hoping to digitize it, make it accessible on the web for everybody. And well, there's a project kind of taking off, but COVID has interrupted everything. So let's see, that is what I'd like to do. In the meanwhile, I have actually shown the work extensively in exhibitions. I've made several photo video installations, I've made photo installations, and the work has traveled to many sites, both within more formal exhibition places like galleries and museums, as well as to women's meetings, and in the early years, even in women's busties and community centers. So the images have circulated. In fact, some of them are familiar. That first image of Satyarani has become a kind of iconic image. Everyone recognizes it, at least within the Indian women's movement. And so they have been shared. And I would like to point out that I made these photographs for ourselves. They were not meant for publication or for newspapers or for anybody else, really. In the early years, they were very much part of feminists traveling to other parts of the country, sometimes beyond the country, to share what we were doing, what was happening in Delhi, in India, movements connecting with other women's movements against violence. And it was a record for ourselves. So it's been shared considerably in various formats, and I hope to actually be able to create something which will mean much wider access.
Right. Thank you, Sheba. So the next question is, so the participant wants to know, what do you feel about paying subject? When you go photograph the subjects, what are your opinions on paying the subjects? Because in these times of extreme distress, you start thinking about money, and so the photographer wants to know, is it okay to pay the subject, or how do you, since they are being photographed and the photographs are being circulated, so what are the ethics involved in this case? So anyone would like to take up this question? Sheba?
It's a tricky question. There are a number of ethical questions involved. One is the question of privacy and encroachment, which Agastya just spoke about, and she said it's something photographers just have to accept, that this is what the photographer does. And at the bottom line, I would agree with her. But I think that can be negotiated, that can be opened up, that can be the manner of that encroachment can be made something which is respectful, which includes the subject's own agency, which is one of the things I was trying to talk about. And so I think there's a whole ethical charge to the kind of process I was talking about, which includes the subject's agency. This is in terms of control over the production of the image, the creation of the image. Other ethical questions which have to do with money. I think different photographers negotiate this differently. I have, wherever possible, tried to share some of what I might have received, if not directly to the subject, by contributing to the cause or the context from which the subject emerged. That is one way. What's happened with me is also that I made these photographs 80s, 90s, and it's only really now in the last 4 or 5 years that the work has gone into a museum collection for which I have received money. And unfortunately, most of these women are no longer there. It's really sad. But my commitment to use that money towards work that furthers our shared beliefs, I think, is some kind of, maybe it's a rationalization, but it does feel better that, you know, one is not just gobbling it up. It's a tricky issue. I also think that monetizing this interaction is not always it's not an easy way out of the ethical questions, because if you say, I paid her for it, and therefore I'm free to do what I like with that image, this is also for me problematic. This is very much how the commercial photographer and the commercial art world operates. And I have ethical issues with that. I have moral issues with that. So one thing that is critical is permission, is actually the person giving clear, informed, contextualized permission for the use of the images within certain contexts. For example, the photographs I've made of the movement are not available to any private collector for sale. They're only available for public institutions, because I believe showing these in a museum reaches a wide number of people, and this is consonant with the permission that the women gave me. So I think it also needs to be worked out with each instance, but there's a broad moral, ethical responsibility that we have to find ways to figure out.
Right, thank you so much, Sheba. The next question is for Dipti, and this will be the last question that we take today. So Deepti, how would you juxtapose the reproduction of the mystified ideal of the happy woman in the tea garden with the carefully constructed pictures of the tourists wearing local clothing and appropriating the narrative in a completely decontextualized way?
So yeah, if I'm not wrong, did you just say if I just heard it clearly, it's about the juxtaposition of two images of one which is produced through the colonial tourist gaze,
Right.
one in terms of the colonial mysticized, right? So, but
Right.
that is precisely what I'm saying about, like, you know, what I said in the last, in response to the last question also, about like who is taking the photograph and what is the context in which it is being taken and what does it seek to reproduce, right? So that revolves around the whole idea of, like, you know, like, for us in the Darjeeling Hills, it's always been about like trying to seek more beyond this idea of being represented through this gaze as a tourist place, as a hill station, and which is what is being constantly reinforced. So, I mean, I also do have a problem with this whole idea of cultural appropriation, which is borderline problematic with a lot of things. But yeah, I mean, whenever my college is situated right next to the zoo, so which is a hub for the tourist destination, so whenever I see a lot of it happening, and then when I see this process being carried forward in front of my eyes, I am very, like, I'm disturbed by a lot of things that goes around. But that's precisely the kind of narrative that is coming out from both these images, of in terms of how the place continues to be shrouded in mysticism and in this image of being understood through the tourist gaze and through the colonial lays of simply as a very peaceful hill station, and trope, like dangerously located within these tropes of like ideas of the tea, the mountains, and the beautiful weather. So that is precisely my point, where I am located from, and when I try to locate the questions of identities and conflict in this region, that the place is much more than that. There is a history to it, which first of all needs a recognition of the place being, like, located in a situation of conflict. So that is why a lot of struggles, a lot of spontaneous movements keep taking place in the keep emerging out of a lot of triggers. A lot of thing acts as triggers to ignite the conflict, which is why, and then when that happens, it just does not make sense to anyone, because like you would have just visited the place and you would have been a tourist out there, and when the conflict takes place, you are stranded, and then you're suddenly like, it's such a peaceful place, why is there suddenly a situation of conflict and violence in the place? So that is where it recognizes and where it necessitates a rereading of the place beyond what is being constantly reproduced as that. And that is where I hope that the new mediums, like when we have this initiative being taken by Zubaan through THL, where a lot of new forms of medium are being used to rewrite the history of the place, that it's an attempt, it's a humble procedure in the making, and an ongoing process by a lot of us engaged in dialogue, where we are trying to help reproduce a new narrative where we sort of move away from these kind of a construction of the place. So I stick to my point of what I was trying to say earlier, that whether you bring in the whole idea of representing the place and trying to highlight the culture and accommodative attitude towards minorities and communities which have complicated histories, it's not going to be a resolution to the problem. But in recognizing and calling it out is where I think the beginning, where we can begin by trying to locate specific cases and specific contexts.
Thank you so much, Dipti. Thank you so much, Dipti. So we shall end the session here, and we will share all the unanswered questions to the speakers, and we will send them your responses. So thank you to all the speakers today, Sheba, Dipti, Agastaya. Our next session in this series is on visual archives, documenting stories of marginalized communities through photography, on Friday, 29th May at 4 p.m. Nayantara Gurung Kshapati, Janisha Ungvi, and Prashansa Guru. The recording of our first webinar in this series is now up on YouTube. You'll find the link in the chat box. Further, if you wish to watch a previous session on a crisis of care, feminist perspectives on the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown in India, you can go on our YouTube page. You'll find the link to that video in the chat box. And please follow us on social media for future events. Have a good week, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.